Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is the next installment of this incredible series by JackLaFountain, available for purchase now over on the Amazon website. Of course, I'll leave the link to that in the description box below. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Tracks, Rock Creek, Karma, the Autumn Story. Let's get straight into that. An introduction. The goal of authenticity in fiction is a challenge for writers. I explain this concept in greater detail in the introduction to The Winter Story. Suffice it to say here that, to advance the goal of realism, I wanted to write these stories in places where I have lived and worked. As I had planned this second story, I really wanted to set it in Oklahoma. I lived there for many years and was living there still while I wrote this story. And so I began my research at a familiar source, among the reports of encounters compiled by the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. This particular encounter sprang out at me like a tiger from those reports. I've heard it said, truth is stranger than fiction. In this case, it could not have been truer. The first shock was to find it was a report from my longtime home, Sulphur, Oklahoma. The second jolt was to find that the encounter not only took place in that area, but in the park that abuts the town, with its city lights and all. I happened to be living in Sulphur at the time this encounter took place, though I heard nothing about it in the talk that circulates through the town like the Oklahoma wind. The coup de grace, the third and most fortuitous shock in the report, was that the encounter actually happened on Halloween night. What more could a writer ask for? And so, the story presented here closely follows that report. I added a second experience that was personally recounted to me, and with a tragic, or according to your outlook on life, an inspiring twist. Most Bigfoot encounters are surprises that occur while cameras and recorders are out of pocket or cannot be brought to bear. A couple of those surprises are waiting for you in Rock Creek, Karma. Chapter 1. The north wind was sweeping down the plains, bullying its way through the intersections along Muskogee Street and wedging itself between the booths that already lined the sidewalks, ready to offer games, crafts, and edibles for the evening crowd to come. It was getting to be a real regular occurrence that the first real, shiver-inducing cold of the year should arrive on Halloween. The day before, it had been a sunny 70 degrees. Daria and her brother Ben based their plans for a night at the town festival on that information. Their excitement was at a fever pitch because Euphoria would be playing in Portman Park during the celebration. Such were the twin follies of youth and the Oklahoma weather forecasting. But the morning of the bash found the sky blanketed with dark clouds, low riding on the wind and bending the treetops towards the south. From the living room window, Daria watched her neighbor across the street, dressed like an Arctic explorer, trundling from his door to the pickup parked in his driveway. Even from that distance, she could make out the plumes rising from his breath. Again, Ben, who stood sullenly beside her, moaned. Every year, it's the same old story. Can we have some decent outdoor weather on Halloween for a change? Maybe you two should watch the weather reports now and then, their father said from the comfort of his recliner. Very informative stuff. They have a woman who comes on the screen and lets you know what the weather will be like the next day. Funny, Dad, Daria said with an exasperated sigh. Just trying to help. What would help? she replied. "As if you would let us use your car tonight so we don't have to walk downtown in the cold." "Okay," he said. "But you drive, Daria, not Ben." "What?" Ben broke in. "Why her?" "Because you will be with a band," their father explained. "You're apt to leave it parked somewhere unattended and go off to God knows where." "He's got you there, Ben," Daria said with a laugh. By the time for the downtown festivities, the temperature had risen a bit, or at least it felt like it did. As the wind had slackened off, Daria, dressed in jeans and a red Sulphur High School sweatshirt, pulled on her coat and shouted for Ben to get a move on. After the second summons, Ben emerged from the bathroom, where he'd spent 20 minutes. Combing his hair, she thought, and doing whatever boys found to do in there for that long. He grabbed a cap and hauled it down tight over his freshly coiffed hair. Daria supposed it was a good thing her brother always wore a cap. It probably kept him from leaving his head somewhere. "Where's your bass?" Daria asked. "Ha!" he said. "You thought I forgot? No way. It's in Terry's van. We put everything in there after school yesterday." "You mean there's actually a brain between the four of you?" When we put our heads together," Ben said. "Let's go." Their father's car was a beige '88 Ford Bronco that they would rather not be seen in, but in desperate times, and all that. It was late twilight when they arrived. They parked in the Redone shelter's parking lot and walked across the street to Portman Park. They reached their destination just as Terry was backing his van up near the stage. She hated to admit it, even to herself, but it was kinda cool to have a brother in a band. Pretty good band at that. It wasn't that she lacked for friends or anything. The problem was that Daria was smart. Too smart for most of her peers. It took her a while to understand that. As problems go, intelligence was not a bad one to have. But it did make for an uphill battle to fit in sometimes when you knew all the answers in class. Classmates had the mistaken idea that all she did was study and read. She loved to read and preferred books to movies. That much was true. However, she rarely studied. She didn't need to. Schoolwork and, more importantly, learning, it came easy. Her mind was sharp, and she picked up facts and the concepts behind them readily. Still, it was hard to break the brainy stereotype, and though her frequent looks in the mirror had failed to convince her otherwise. Her friend Edie tried to assure her that lots of boys stared at her from behind her back. Her dark copper hair that fell about the shoulders, her quick smile, and her graceful curves painted her a winner. Edie guessed that what they saw about her friend was more intimidating than stereotypical. Daria left Ben with his buddies and walked up the hill towards Muskogee Street. The road was lined with cars whose owners had come early enough to claim the prime parking spots, and Daria merged into the crowd of excited children, tugging along frazzled parents, wary of collisions with the ones who occasionally broke free. Barricades allowing only foot traffic blocked both ends of Muskogee Street. The noisy sidewalks were lined with racks of clothes on sale, oil paintings and tables of hardware offered by the downtown shops. Booths presenting games and homemade crafts, interspersed with the church groups handing out treats, all packed tightly together, turned the street into a carnival midway. The air smelled of hot dogs, barbecue, and funnel cakes. Daria passed by all the games with their cheap novelty prizes until she came to the Dunkin' booth, sponsored by the Sulphur High School senior class. That was her class. Mr. Ames was sitting in the seat above the water tank. He taught senior English. He was one of her favorite teachers. But a chilly Dunkin' seemed in order, given the amount of homework he'd assigned them for the holiday weekend. Now he was still dry, and the allure of sending him into the water with the icy wind whipping up Muskogee Street at that moment was too great of a temptation to overcome. Her best friend, Edie Mae Tubby, just happened to be already towing the mark ahead of her, and to Daria's secret glee, the girl missed on all 3 tries. Now Daria pushed forward, plopping down $1 for the next 3 balls before Edie could do so. Sometimes Daria pitched for the softball team, and she stepped up to the mark with confidence in her ability to send the teacher down with a splash. Her first try sailed just over the target and brought faint jeers from Mr. Amos. Her next shot was too low. Determined to win, she took 3 steps back from the tape, marking a pitch in line. She set her hands in front of her and stepped forward with her arm swinging like a windmill over her head and released the ball from her hip. The round, metal target rang out the sound of victory. The force of the pitch left a baseball-sized dent in the target, and Mr. Amos's eyes went wide as he was suddenly suspended in the empty air. He hit the water, sending up a spray that chased back the onlookers. A round of applause went up for both the young pitcher and the brave teacher, and Daria gave him a friendly wave, and Mr. Amos shouted out a promise of revenge when they would meet again in class the following Monday. "Hey, I wanted to be the one to dunk him, girl," her friend said, trotting to catch up with her. You had a chance," Daria said with a smile. "You want to hang out? Come on, I want a corn dog. How about you?" Now Daria took off towards the brightly decorated truck parked in the middle of the block without waiting for a reply. Edie quickly caught up, walking at her shoulder without bothering to answer. "2 corn dogs," Daria told the man in the truck and turned to Edie. "I'm fine. I did kinda root you out of the line back there," she chuckled. Edie offered to buy their Cokes. Twin golden delights of deep-fried cornbread batter covered a dubious combination of pork and chicken appeared at the window. The girls slathered them with mustard and sauntered off through the crowd, munching and sipping happily until they heard the band begin to warm up. "Hey, that's your brother," Edie said. "Let's go listen. I think he's cute, you know." "Yeah, I know," Daria said. "You say that every time." "Well, he's cute every time. That's why. Now, come on." Weaving their way through the crowd while guarding their sodas from the elbows and shoulders of the milling mob, they made their way past the barricade of the Muskogee and 4th and started down the hill towards the park. It wasn't much of a park, just wide expanse of grass with a bandstand, and the girls were still half a block away when the band launched into Sunshine of Your Love. Edie grabbed Daria by the hand and broke into a trot. When they got to the park, she pulled Daria along to the front of the crowd that was building up at the small stage in the centre of the park. And the growing number of dancers gradually pushed those directly in front of the stage into the wings. Edie and Daria found themselves clinging tightly to the corner of the stage, looking out on a sea of gyrating bodies while being forced to shout to hear themselves talk. It was just as well. Conversation was not what they came for, anyway. Edie was whisked off to dance and Daria found herself alone. She wasn't sure just what drew her eye. Glancing over her left shoulder, she made eye contact with a tall boy, with black hair and eyes to match. He didn't look away from her like most guys. Instead, his lips parted into a soft smile that spread over his face like a breath of gentle wind. His eyes held hers for a moment before he raised a hand to wave at her, and without thinking, she returned the wave. When her hand came to rest at her side once more, she realized she too was smiling. "Hey, what are you... Oh, I see," Edie said. "It's Jake." "Yeah, Jake Wilson," Daria heard herself answer in a disconnected, distant voice. "Oh my God, he's coming over," Edie gushed. Daria felt a hand on her shoulder that not so gently nudged her forward to meet the approaching boy. She stumbled a step before catching her balance and turning her eyes up to look into those looking back at her. "Hello, Daria, isn't it?" he said. "I remember you from Miss Dixon's algebra." "Yes," she said. "I'm surprised you remember, though." How could I forget the smartest girl in class?" "Actually, that was me," Edie cut in. Daria shot daggers at her. "Well, maybe it was the prettiest girl," he amended. Daria felt her face flush, but was powerless to stop it. "Dance?" he asked, hand extended. "But they're not playing any music," Daria said. They will," he countered, giving her hand a tug. "Come on." He led her towards the others waiting in front of the bandstand for the next song, and Daria heard a shrill whistle from behind her. She felt a mild anger rise in her. She didn't need to look back to know Edie just whistled and pointed for Ben to look at her. Then the next song was a slow, romantic ballad. Came as no surprise. The surprise was how comfortably she slid into Jake's arms and swayed to the music. He radiated strength and confidence she'd never felt in a guy's arms before. She relaxed and leaned into him, and was lost for a moment in his arms and in the allure of the music. The song ended too soon. He walked her back to where Edie waited and faded away into the crowd. "Why did you do that?" Daria said, but her irritation turned into a mischievous smile. "Thanks." "Ooh, he's so cute," Edie said. "What are you doing? Go after him." "I will not." "But why?" "Because he's coming back." "Well, last song, y'all," Terry announced from the stage. "We have to close it down. Is there an after party?" "Yep, buddy, you know there is. The trick is to find out where. The treat is when you get there. I'll see y'all later." Daria looked at her watch. It really was 10 o'clock, and she wondered where the time went. And then she glanced at Jake standing beside her and knew. "Do you want to go to their party?" Daria asked with a smile. "Sure," Jake said. "Do you know where it's at?" "Of course. My brother is the bass player." "Really? I didn't know that. Where is it then?" "It's out at Veterans Lake." "Veterans Lake for Halloween?" he said with a quick tilt of his head and a raised eyebrow. "What?" It's haunted by the Lady of the Lake, you know." And she shrugged and laughed. "Yeah, well, nobody's going swimming on a night like this." And keeping her word to her father, Daria arranged for Jake to meet her at the lake. After clearing the gate there, she turned right onto the road that ran through the park on a parallel course with a row of porch lights just beyond the park fence along Lindsay Street. Once the road crossed Rocks Creek, it turned away from town into the growing darkness. And the night closed in as the road wound uphill for a ways before dropping down to hug the northern edge of the lake. It came to an end in a small parking area, near the spot where Wilson's Creek emptied into the lake, and the lights of the partygoers chased away the darkness. The paved circle, it was already filled with cars. Daria turned around in a cramped lot and parked along the ditch on the side of the road farthest from the lake. "Parking for a quick getaway?" Jake asked as he walked over to meet her. "I think you may have done this before." Maybe," she said. "Never hurts to be prepared." Jake shrugged and held the door for her as she climbed out. His hand slipped gently into hers as they walked towards the shore. He led her to the raging bonfire that burned in the middle of the circle of lawn chairs linked with a few boulders and 2 large logs. They found a place to sit and snuggled together on one of the logs. The fire was pleasant to watch, but it was Jake who held the cold and wind at bay. Warm and relaxed, she breathed deeply of his intoxicating cologne. Jake soon excused himself, leaving her cold and missing him. He returned only a few minutes later with the twin red cups topped with foam. He handed her one and resumed his place at her side. She took a small sip and shuddered at the bitter taste and smiled up at him. "I should be ashamed to say this," she said, "but I'm not much of a beer drinker." "It's okay. Not everyone likes the taste. This one?" He raised his cup. "That's not my idea of good beer. I don't really hold with my friends claim that bad beer is better than no beer. But this'll have to do for tonight." "Really? Aren't they all about the same?" Blasphemy," he said with a mock surprise. "It's hard to tell with these cups, but you should not be able to see through beer. At least not the kind that I like. The darker, the better." Jake was not that far removed from sulphur high, she thought, to have tasted much in the way of sophistication, but a laugh at his worldly boast only increased his smile. Daria was charmed to meet a guy who didn't take a little laugh at his expense as an attack on his ego. She battled her way through the beer, just to show that she could, but By the time she neared the bottom of the cup, she felt much warmer than the fire could account for, and happier that Jake's nearness had a right to claim. Her brother Ben and the band finally arrived, and they were met with cheers and calls for more music. Acoustic guitars appeared from the van, and once the band was armed with the red cups of their own, the music resumed. And Jake refilled their cups, and they sipped beer and listened to a few songs before he looked up at the moon. Let's take a walk. He stood and held out a hand. As she took his, feeling a little silly when she wobbled slightly. She put her arm through his, leaning on him as they walked to the edge of the lake. The short distance had a profound effect on the light and sound. The gibbous moon peeking through a break in the clouds shimmered on the surface of the lake, and she sighed and rested her head on his shoulder. The spell of night seeped into the surrounding air, seeming to draw them further away into its power. Daria sat transfixed on the loveliness, her eyes scanning the surface of the water. She shivered as the north wind blew about them, and Jake slipped his arm around her shoulders. Yahoo! A chorus of voices screamed. Ben and his bandmates, clad only in their underwear, ran past them, shoving each other and jumping in their mad dash for the water. They hit the lake in great high steps and plunged in, sending plumes of water skyward that splashed down on Daria. She leaped onto Jake's chest, both arms clamped around his neck. "You assholes!" she screamed at the splashing revelers. "Ben Snyder, you damn idiot! Get out of that water now!" A small knot of partiers gathered in the wake of the boys charging into the water, laughing at the offshore antics. Sis, lighten up a bit," he replied. "We're just having fun. You should try it sometime." "Get out of that water!" Daria screamed at him. You better, Ben," somebody behind her yelled. "The lady of the lake will get you." Ben began trudging to shore, dripping water and shivering violently. The rest of the band followed suit. "You okay, Daria?" Edie asked as they walked back to the fire. "Yeah, I'm all right. Or at least I was until those lunkheads came screaming by and ruined the magic of the night." Now they found seats by the fire, and Daria and Edie sat between Jake and Pete, who were enjoying the steady flow of beer. Daria sipped without enthusiasm, putting up a brave show and dumping the offensive liquid out when Jake wasn't looking. "I don't want to find out. I'm gagging already," Daria told her. Mention of the Lady of the Lake turned the party away from music and dancing to the holiday's more traditional campfire fare. A string of stories about haunted houses and local ghosts followed. The tales degenerated into the rehashing of my cousin's roommate's best friend's encounter with various urban legends. This is all bullcrap," Pete said. "None of that stuff is real." "Don't be so sure," Edie spoke up. Knowing what was coming next, Daria laid a hand on her friend's arm and shook her head. Edie waved away the caution. "It's okay," she said, sitting up and straightening her shoulders. "This clown here needs to hear the truth, and it wouldn't hurt the rest of you to know it either." Every eye was on her in anticipation. They had all heard the rumors about Abel May Tubby, and like Daria guessed, they were about to get the first-hand story of Edie's infamous ancestor. And family connections were never far from the surface in Murray County. Edie was 2 generations removed, but the stories of Abel clung to her family like the Oklahoma red dirt. "My grandfather was often the drunken Indian everybody says he was. That's true enough. But he was not crazy, ever. I remember him well." She looked defiantly around the group before going on. "He had been a respectable, church-going man when he was young. He went to work here in the park with the CCC. "The what?" Pete interrupted. "It will be you," Edie said, rolling her eyes. "I wasn't planning on giving a history lesson, but literally, for Pete's sake, here it is. The CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was a government work program during the Great Depression. Any of this sound familiar to y'all? Ask your grandfathers. They'll explain." "Oh," Terry exclaimed. "So, That's why those letters are on so many of the buildings in the Lincoln Bridge." Edie gave him a weak smile and nodded. "I thought they were some guy's initials," he added. "Anyway," she continued with a sigh, "my grandfather, he was working with a crew building a bromide pavilion. The rest of the men went off to eat their dinner in the shade and he was just finishing stacking a load of rock. He heard a sound coming from downstream on Rock Creek. He said it sounded like something beating against a tree and went to see what it was." And she paused for a moment and looked around at her friends. "When he got closer to the trees, he saw this shadow move away. It looked like a man. There were a lot of men wandering the country, hopeless and jobless then. But my grandpa said that this guy, he looked unusually big and strong. And so he went after him, thinking maybe he might want to get hired on their crew." "Just tell the story," somebody muttered. "My grandfather hadn't gone far back into the trees when the man he was after stopped and turned around. It was not a man. It was an enormous creature covered with black hair. Its long arms were stretched between two oak trees, a hand around each one. He later went back to measure the distance between the trees. It was 10 feet. The place where his hands had grasped the trees was 8 feet off the ground. That was at the creature's shoulder." Some skeptical laughter broke out, but Edie kept right on talking. "He said the two of them just stood there, looking at each other for what seemed like forever, though it was probably no more than a minute. And then the creature snapped off the tops of the trees like they were nothing and walked towards my grandfather. He said he had never been so scared in his life, not before and never once after." And she glanced towards where the laughter had come from and arched an eyebrow. And then she continued with the story. "It tilted its head to one side and then the other, like it had never seen anything like my grandfather. Or at least, that's what he thought at the time. It handed one of the trees to him, and Grandpa could barely hold it with his two hands." And she paused to look around again, making sure the listeners were still with her. "And so, the creature grunted a couple of times like it was laughing at him, and then it turned and walked away. But as it got back to the place where it had stopped and turned around, my grandfather said 2 more creatures, and one of them, a little one, stepped out of the trees to meet it. The big one grunted again and they all disappeared into the woods." Some of the people were starting to shift restlessly. Still dragging the broken tree, he wandered back to the crew. When he told them what happened, they laughed at him, called him crazy. They said he was drunk. He was fired the next day for being drunk on the job. A couple of the guys got up and went for more beer. Edie went on, relentless to reach the end of her tale. He spent the rest of his life broken and eventually became the drunk they accused him of being. When he was old, he disappeared one day. My dad found him sitting beneath the trees below Bromide Hill. The authorities said he died of exposure, but what they never reported was that there was no alcohol in his system. Nor did they say that there were gigantic footprints to be clearly seen around the tree where he died. My dad said there was a peace about the place where they found him, and he thought that was because his spirit was at rest with what he'd seen years before. The men in my family, well, they still go there to seek peace, especially when they are troubled. A silence met the end of her story. It didn't last long as those who hadn't already done so freshened their cups of beer, and the party went on for most of them. "Well, that was a real downer," Pete said. "You're such an asshole," Daria said, leaning around Edie to glare at him. Let's get out of here," Jake whispered to her. "Okay, but I need to talk to Edie alone first," Daria said. "Come on, Edie." They walked away from the fire to stand on a deserted side of the road, and Daria put an arm around her friend. "That was very brave of you," she said. "We're going to get out of here for a while. I'll meet you at the Easy Go at midnight." Chapter 3. Daria regretted her promise of keeping her father's car with her at all times. There was something good about her fidelity to her word, but it didn't ease the loss of a chance to sit beside Jake as he drove. She had a moment of consolation, though, when she arrived upon noticing the absence of other cars in a parking lot. They would have the overlook to themselves. She took his hand as they walked the hard gravelly path to the jutting slab of barren travertine that overlooked the park and downtown Sulphur. Bromide Hill rose out of the west side of the park, a challenging hike for those walking along Rock Creek, but easily accessible by car from Perimeter Road. The wind swept through the scattered cedar and oak around the bit of bare rock where they sat, chilling their ears and noses. And Jake sheltered her in the lee of his body and pulled her close. The lights of the town spread out in twinkling panorama beneath them. The moon glowed behind thin clouds. "Beautiful," Jake whispered. Daria turned to see that he was not admiring the town lights. His eyes drank in her face with a tenderness that emanated through to her heart. She leaned closer, and their lips met. His lips were soft on hers, but there was a strength behind them, a pleasant firmness without insistence. When they parted, he laid a warm hand on her cheek. The kiss was pleasant, warm while it lasted, but she was shivering. He chuckled softly and fixed her with a smile. "This was not the best idea I've ever had," he said. "You're freezing out here." "I'm fine," she said. "I enjoy being with you." "I enjoy being with you too, but let's be together enjoying someplace warmer." "Okay," she agreed. "But first," she took his face in her hands and drew it to hers. 30 minutes later, Jake turned the key in the ignition and started the heater to remove the fog from the windows. Daria felt as light as the butterflies that were fluttering inside her. That feeling was a bit too good to stay where they were, though, and she had given her word to Edie. "I have to meet Edie at the Easy Go," she told him. "What time?" 10 minutes ago," she said with a laugh and a devilish grin. "Let's take my car, and we can come back and get yours later." A huge smile lit his face as he unwrapped his arms from around her. It took a few minutes for the engine in her dad's old Bronco to warm up. They spent the time with lips pressed together, rather than bothering with any small talk. "We better go," he said, taking her by surprise. "I thought you liked kissing me," she said in a mock complaint. "I do." He was smiling. "I like it so much that I will not endanger it by keeping you from your friends. Come on, let's go before I change my mind." She kissed him quickly on the cheek and put the car in gear. Daria exited the parking area, making a right onto Perimeter Road, heading for the 12th Street gate at the foot of the hill. The road winding down the hill was dark, and Daria switched on the high beams for the trip. As the road leveled out onto the approach of Rock Creek, they met an oncoming car. She dimmed the lights, but the oncoming car did not, blinding her. She slowed to a near stop and let it pass. She was still seeing spots as they reached the little concrete bridge over the creek. "Look out!" Jake yelled as they rolled onto the bridge, and Daria slammed on the brakes. A blurry figure from the campground to their left bolted across in front of them. In a kind of parting shot, it slapped the passenger fender with its hand and ran down the road towards the creek. "You son of a bitch!" Jake yelled. He threw open the door and was out of the car in pursuit of the prankster before Daria could stop him. "Jake, wait!" she called after him. She threw the car into park and jumped out after him, and she found him in a wash of her headlights at the side of the creek, where he was standing stock still and staring downstream. "Jake?" That was all she got out before seeing the look of shock frozen on his face. She turned her head towards the spot where his eyes were transfixed. Her breath caught in her throat. And standing across the creek about 20 yards south of Jake was a black figure covered with long hair from head to toe. The dim light highlighted a hairless face and with a heavy brow that reminded her of a gorilla. And even as the thought spread through her mind, she knew that was no gorilla. It raised its long arms, flinging them at Jake in a kind of shoe motion. When Jake did not respond, it whirled in a graceful turn and started down the creek towards what appeared to be a large boulder at the water's edge. Daria felt the strength and color drain from her, cascading from her face to her feet. When the creature had covered about 10 yards, the supposed boulder, it began to rise. Her bladder demanded all her focus to keep from surrendering to fear. The sudden need to divert her attention brought the situation into a clear, slow-moving focus. The boulder grew from 4 or 5 feet to well over 8 feet tall, covered with the same long, dark hair. And seeing her and Jake, it let out a rumbling growl that she could feel vibrating on her skin. The menace in that sound, it was unmistakable. She grabbed Jake by the sleeve and tugged with all of her might, and he stumbled a step, regained his balance, and was moving with her towards the car. They climbed inside and locked the doors. "Back up some," Jake said, and she complied without asking why. The edge of her headlights fell across the two figures, and she switched to high beams. Instantly illuminated in the bright light, the creatures held their ground, and Daria, as she gasped. "What the hell is that?" Jake said. The answer was a flying stone the size of a football, unleashed in a lazy toss by the enormous creature. Thankfully, the stone sailed harmlessly over the car, landing on the road behind them with a loud crash. When the creature stooped for another rock, Daria gunned the engine, laying a small patch of rubber on the bridge as they raced away. She only slowed slightly for the sharp left turn to exit the park. Under the lights of 12th Street, flying past rows of houses, she could breathe again. Luckily, the light at 12th and Broadway was green. She bounced through the intersection and rocketed into the parking spot under the glaring lights in front of the store. She switched off the engine as the tremors hit. Tears exploded, and she buried her face into Jake's chest until a pounding fist on her car window called her away. "What the hell is going on?" Edie shouted at her through the glass. "You bastard, Jake Wilson! What did you do to her?" Jake shook his head and lifted his hand in a show of innocence. Daria cranked down the window while trying to choke off the tears and tremors long enough to defend him. "It's okay," Daria sputtered. "He didn't do anything. We saw." "Shh," Jake warned. "Hold on a minute. Let's think about this first." "Think about what? You saw it too," Daria told him. "That doesn't mean we need to tell everybody," he said. "Let's go inside and get a Coke and think about this. That's all I'm saying." "Okay, but we have to tell somebody," she replied. "We need to at least report it to the park ranger." "Come on, let's go inside, please." As she got out, checked the fender for damages, and with a great heave of relief, found none. Jake slid in next to her at the booth by the window of the Easy Go. Edie and Pete took up the bench opposite them. Daria guessed by the look in Jake's eyes that he was not happy with the present company. Daria shrugged inwardly. Edie was her best friend, and she would tell Edie no matter what Jake said, so why not now? She laid a hand on his, hoping to communicate her satisfaction with the situation. He seemed to relax, but she was not sure if it was in agreement with her or surrender to the inevitable. "Okay, you've stalled long enough," Edie said at last, tapping her finger on the table. "What the hell happened to y'all?" "Well," Daria began, "we went up to Bromide Hill." "Daria!" Edie exclaimed. "Oh, Edie." Daria waved her friend's shock away. "Don't act so surprised. Do you want to hear this or not?" "Go on. I'll keep quiet." Edie made a zipping motion across her lips. "We went up to Bromide Hill," Daria began again. "It was freezing up there when I was supposed to meet you, and so we left. Late." "Oops," Edie said. "Yes." Daria smiled at her. "Late. I'm sorry." "Liar," Edie said with a laugh. "Okay," Daria said with a glance at Jake. "I'm not sorry. Now, let me finish. We started down Perimeter Road for 12th Street. And just as we got to the bridge, some guy blinded me with his brights." Luckily she wasn't going very fast, Jake added. "Anyway, right after that," and Daria went on, "somebody came running out of the campground, right in front of the car. He slapped the fender as he ran by, and so Jake jumped out and chased after the guy, but it wasn't a guy." "So?" Edie prodded when Daria fell silent. "What was it?" "I don't know. I don't know," Daria muttered in a voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know. It was about 6 feet tall and covered with hair." "Daria," said Pete, "it's freaking Halloween, remember? I was some drunk ass in a costume." "No, it wasn't," she said. "Give me a little credit, would you? It wasn't a costume. No, it was too natural, too real. No way it was a costume. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human." Bull," he insisted. "Shut up, Jake." "Shut up, Pete," Jake fired back. "You weren't there." "Did you see this thing?" Pete asked him. "Damn right." Jake's eye was up. "I was real, man. I'm telling you. And as long as we're telling it, there wasn't just one." "What?" "The thing we saw ran down Rock Creek and there was another one. A bigger one. Much bigger one. It looked just like the one that ran in front of the car, except it had to be 9 feet tall." "They were Sasquatch," Edie broke in. "Bigfoot. Oh, Daria, don't look so shocked. You know I've studied this stuff." "Oh, I know," Daria said. "But I didn't think you really believed it. I thought you just studied it because your grandfather's story. Damn, girl, you always have all the luck. Do you know what I'd give for a look at one of them?" "You can have it," Daria said. "I never want to see one again." "Well, you're going to," Edie told her, "because we're all going back out there." "Tonight?" Daria asked. "Right now," Edie said. "Let's go. Come on, move it. I'm serious." "I'm game," Pete said, slipping from the booth behind Edie. Edie grabbed Daria by the hand and pulled her from the seat. She didn't resist beyond a mechanical, reluctant step, and with a shrug of his shoulders, Jake came along. "We have to get my car, anyway," he whispered to Daria. "Okay, I'm driving," Daria announced. "When I say go, we go. I'll leave anybody that doesn't move their butt when I say so. That includes you, Edie Mae Tubby." Yeah, Edie said. "Let's go." They parked at the entrance of the Rock Creek campground. Daria retrieved a flashlight from the toolbox in the back of the car. They walked back towards the bridge in the cone of the Bronco's headlights. "Look at that," Jake said, pointing at the shattered rock in the middle of the road. "That's what they threw at us. It was standing on the far side of the creek when they threw it." "Damn," Pete said. "That had to weigh 30 pounds. On the far side of Rock Creek was bare travertine, and the trees stood back from the creek, making a search for tracks futile. But Edie was determined to search for tracks anyway. Finding no sign of the creatures along the creek, they started back to the car. Edie came to a sudden stop halfway across the bridge, her flashlight playing near the creek. "Oh my God, look!" she said, pointing at a spot on the bank. She ran across the bridge and down the slope to the water's edge. In a bit of sandy soil between outcroppings of travertine was an 1.5-inch depression, bearing a resemblance to a human heel. "Bring your enormous feet over here, Pete," she ordered. And Pete, following her directions, laid his shoe beside the imprint. The heel print dwarfed the heel of his size 13 shoe. "That's big," he said. "Yeah," Edie admitted. "Too bad it's only a heel and not a full print. Surely though it will help the park rangers to believe us?" Daria said. "You can't tell them about this," Edie insisted. "Why not?" "First of all," Edie said, "because they'll do their best to tell you it was a bear or a guy in a costume, and you're a hysterical kid." "But the print, the rock." "I didn't say they won't believe you," Edie explained. "They already know they're here. I said they will try to convince you otherwise, and they will also do what they have to do to discredit your report." "Why would they do that?" "They can't let these stories out," Edie explained. "It would attract too much of the wrong kind of attention. People with guns and curiosity seekers tramping through here and tearing up the park. That's just the beginning." "So, who do we tell?" Daria asked. "Nobody. There's no point in it," Edie said. "Not until the day we have proof that they exist. Until then, you are just inviting ridicule." "I agree," Jake added. "We don't need that. We need to keep this whole thing quiet." "Are you afraid of your buddies and that they'll laugh at you?" Daria asked. "No, it's not that," he said. "We just should not go around telling everyone." Tracks, Rock Creek Karma, The Autumn Story. Chapter 4. Let's get straight into that. Leaves shuffled by a gentle breeze stirred on the ground at Daria's feet. The sun, looking like one of the bright yellow asters on the table, was moving down a pale sky. The cloudless day had blossomed bright and warm. Her mother, seeing the weatherman had gotten it right, took advantage of what was forecast to be the last warm day of fall and announced there would be a party. It was Veterans Day. "Time for one more barbecue before putting the grill up for winter," her father said. Daria's downturned mouth curled up at the corners slightly in a humorless smile. He said the same thing every year, only to drag it out again on the first clear winter day when the temperature was above freezing. When Daria said that she didn't want to invite anyone, her mother demanded that she put an end to her moping and at least invite one person. To keep the peace with her mother and to keep from explaining her depression to anyone, she had invited Edie. Edie was the only one who knew about her interest in Jake and the devastating effect of his broken promise to call her. She guessed her brother, if he ever stopped to consider it, probably suspected something. However, his rampant self-absorption seemed to keep him from acknowledging that a huge black hole had taken the place of her heart. The sweet savour of brisket hovered in the backyard. Tables and chairs scattered over the patio awaited a score of guests. Repeated chimes at the doorbell announced each arrival, along with the appearance of casseroles and desserts covered in front of smiling faces. The strains of her parents' classic rock music, which they refused to call oldies, rolled from a disc player set up near the open sliding doors. When Edie arrived, she hustled Daria away from the gathering crowd to the secure sanctuary of her bedroom. The afternoon sojourn outside made the room feel larger somehow. She hated to admit that her mother was right. The walls had been closing in on her. "I hate having to get you back in here after trying for a week to get you out. I'm assuming from the look on your face, he still hasn't called?" "No," Daria whispered. "Okay." Edie stood, hands on hips. "That's it. Morning is officially over. You either call him right now, or you completely forget about him. That's an order." "I am not calling him," Daria protested. "Why not? You're a liberated woman. Call him and ask him out, or at least demand an explanation." "I will not." Daria crossed her arms over her chest and shook her head. "Let me tell you why you need to forget about him," Edie said, holding up her hand and counting on her fingers. 1. If he wanted to talk to you, he would. 2. You're better than that. 3. Danny likes you, and you would need a new excuse not to go out with him. 4. All guys are dickheads. And 5. Jake is the biggest dickhead of them all. How did I do? For the first time in almost 2 weeks, Daria laughed. "Not bad," she said. except you forgot how smart, beautiful, and fun I am." "I left that for you," Edie said. "I'm glad you finally got it. Now, let's go downstairs. I saw an unguarded bottle of rum in the kitchen that wants to meet our cooks." "Oh, Mum," Daria cried and hugged her mother when they arrived in the kitchen. "You were right. This will be a great party. It was just what I needed." The embrace lingered until a shot of rum splashed into the pair of cokes and Edie signaled success. "Well, I'm glad you're better," her mother said, bewilderment in her voice. "What changed your mind?" "Oh, nothing," Daria blurted out, adding, "except I have the best mum in the world." Without a sliver of shame, she left her mother, caught Edie by the arm, and they marched to the patio. Dragging a pair of chairs as far from the tables as possible, they settled in to enjoy the spoils of deception. "I haven't eaten today," Daria said with a laugh. "We better get burgers before I drink this." "Never fear," Edie told her giggling partner. "I'll get us burgers and be right back." "And chips," Daria called after her. "Lots of chips." Even with the food, the purloined rum kindled a warmth the dying sun could not match, creating a dull buzz in Daria's head. "Are you okay?" Edie asked. "Warm fuzzies," Daria whispered, "but I can still walk in a straight line." The pleasant buzz seemed to issue a call for adventure. "Let's go to the park and look for Bigfoot," Edie suggested. "Like they say, the hair of the dog, returning to the scene of the crime, and all that." "Hell yeah," Daria said. "Let's do it. We can take my camera this time." "Where are y'all going?" Ben stopped him as he reached the door. "Out," Daria told him. "Without you." Daria felt a tug on her elbow. Edie looked up from behind the rapidly fluttering eyelids. Daria thought her brother was too young and suddenly far too immature for Edie, but she shrugged off the thought. "Well," Daria said in a defeated voice, "we're going Bigfoot hunting, Ben. Do you still want to go?" "Wow, yeah, but I gotta tell y'all, there ain't no Bigfoots around here anywhere." The girls laughed, and leaving Ben standing there scratching his head for a moment with a look of bewilderment on his face, and they started for Edie's car, while he scurried after them. "Thanks," Edie leaned over and whispered to Daria before starting their engine. "You owe me," Daria shot back. "We're going to the park?" Ben asked when they turned down 12th Street. "Too many people, too many lights. You're not going to find Bigfoot like that. Not in a park." He shrugged away their renewed laughter. Edie pulled her car off the road into Rock Creek Campground parking, where they couldn't be seen from the pavement or the creek. They would plead an innocent walk along the creek if a ranger came by and questioned what they were doing in an empty campground. It was an unlikely possibility. They hoped to go unnoticed, but it wouldn't hurt to have a story ready. When they stepped from the car, dark twilight, deepened by the shadows of the tall oaks, sent Edie rummaging through her glove compartment for a flashlight. And before she turned on the light, they stood quietly, listening to the sound of the creek bobbling while the last of the birdsongs yielded to the coming of the night sounds. Daria took a step away from the car and stopped. The sound of tires on the road announced an approaching vehicle. A sweep of headlights broke through the trees above them. They waited for the sound of the car to fade into the distance before starting out again. They had gone only about 20 feet when they heard another car, this one coming from the opposite direction. "I told you," Ben said. "Too much traffic." "Shut up," Daria whispered. This time the car was coming from their right, down Bromide Hill. They waited, but it didn't pass. As its headlights shined out over the bridge, the car stopped. They heard the doors open and muffled voices. Daria waved to the others to follow. She wanted to look at what was going on in the road that had brought the car to a stop. They crept through the trees, keeping out of sight as much as possible, until they had an unobstructed view of the road and the car. Daria drew a quick breath just as Edie's hand clamped over her mouth. "Shh," Edie cautioned. She shot a glare Ben's way to make sure he understood. The car was a familiar one, as was the driver. Jake climbed down from behind the wheel and a willowy blonde slid out behind him, his arm around her, and he led her onto the bridge. As they watched, he pointed out the place where he'd seen Bigfoot. Bet he didn't mention he was alone, Daria thought. Asshole. The blonde squealed with delight at his animated telling of the tale. She threw her arms around his neck and molded herself to him from the lips on down. Bastard, Edie whispered, ignoring her own admonition. Daria pried her friend's hand from her lips. Don't do it, Edie whispered. Daria didn't answer. She inched forward to the lee of an oak near the edge of the tree line, and she stooped and picked up a large rock lying at the base of the tree. With a roundhouse delivery, she held the stone at the oblivious couple. And there was a loud thud, and Daria returned to Edie, eyes wide. She broke into a run then, pulling her friend and her brother along behind her in a hurried retreat. When they reached the car, she dove inside and closed the door. I didn't mean to hit him, the words burst from her. I meant to throw the rock over his head. You know, give him a scare. I hit him. The rock bounced off his head. Edie and Daria stared at each other for a moment, and then exploded in uncontrolled laughter. The sound must have been contagious, for Ben joined in. Your feet are so tiny, Edie said, through tears of laughter. But damn, girl, you can sling a stone like a Bigfoot. The comment brought on a fresh wave of hilarity, and when it subsided, with all tears, dried and bladder leakage in the negative, Daria sent Ben to see if the car was still parked on the road. But don't let him see you, she warned. Tell the truth, Edie said when he had gone. You did it on purpose. I swear I didn't, Daria said and giggled. Sometimes, though, karma is a bitch. You just put a real period, Edie hit her head with a palm, on that relationship. The minutes stretched out until they wondered what had happened to Ben. Where's your brother? Edie asked at last. Probably lost, Daria said, disgusted that he couldn't do a simple job. Let's go get him. I'm ready to go back home. Daria got out of the car just as Ben wandered into sight. She tilted her head to look at him. Car's gone, he mumbled, but it looked like he was in shock. Ben? Daria said. Are you all right? You'll never believe what I just saw,